Imagine being a queen and discovering that every movement in your bed, every whisper, and even the removal of a simple braid of hair is being recorded by spies behind the curtains. What the spies witnessed in Anne Boleyn's bedchamber was horrifying. Content warning. This film contains references to sexual coercion, enforced separation of children from caregivers, and institutional violence. Some scenes are dramatized and intended to be interpretive. Viewer discretion is advised. What the spies witnessed in Anne Boleyn's bedchamber was horrifying. If, and I stress if, the fragments and patterns we have allow us to imagine such a scene. What follows is a reconstructed composite, dramatized for interpretive purposes. It is not a claim of new documentary proof about any single person. Rather, it is an effort to show how private acts, ritualized and recorded, could prepare someone for public disgrace. Imagine a narrow corridor in a royal residence, its flagstones slick with the damp of a late autumn night. Two watchers, low-ranking household servants turned into informants by politics, press themselves to the shadowed jam. Candlelight slips beneath a half-shut door. Beyond it, a bedchamber, domestic, intimate, and tightly policed, holds a small, terrible economy of tokens. A length of braid wrapped in linen, a personal ring, a scrap of embroidered trim, a child's cradle in the corner, and a ledger left open on a writing desk. This is a reconstructed composite, dramatized for interpretive purposes. The scene that follows borrows from patterns visible in household accounts, from descriptions of how court households managed clothing, livery, and attendance, and from the ways early modern institutions translated persons into paper. Where the record is thin, I draw cautious parallels to contemporaneous practices. Where the record is silent, I keep silence. The aim is to show how ritual, paper, and small gestures of removal could, together, make a person vulnerable to the later, public machinery of accusation and punishment. The candle's guttering light picks out a braid coiled in a palm. Someone moves with the businesslike calm of an officer enacting an instruction. A hand takes scissors or a small blade, not to wound so much as to mark. The braid is cut. The length is folded and hidden into a hem. A ring is removed and placed into a purse. A piece of clothing that once declared rank, an embroidered cuff, a short mantle of a household livery, is stripped away and exchanged for plainer garments kept for those in custody. A steward produces a written warrant of some kind, perhaps a memorandum from a privy seal or a household order, and shows it by the light. A name, a mark, a short phrase that converts presence into possession. A whisper follows, a new designation, a transfer of status. The woman is told, softly and with bureaucratic calm, that she no longer speaks from the same station. The watchers in the corridor make a note in the margins of a small book. What they saw will be written, summoned, and used. Pause to be explicit. This dramatized vignette is interpretive, assembled from the kinds of actions and instruments recorded in Tudor household practice and in the diplomatic and political manuals of the age. It is not a verbatim eyewitness account attributed to Anne Boleyn. We use a composite, Woman in the Bedchamber, to explore a mechanism, how private diminishment can precede and facilitate public punishment. To understand why such quiet acts mattered, we need to step back and see the court as a machine, one that turned persons into names, names into entries, and entries into political instruments. The Tudor household was not a private domestic arrangement in the modern sense. It was a political organ. Its clerks kept ledgers of livery, attendance, and payments. Its stewards controlled who passed through thresholds and who slept where. Chaplains and confessional practices provided vocabulary that could be mobilized to make moral claims. Sergeants-at-arms and officers enforced movements and custody. Together, these officials created the paperwork and ritual that converted a living person into a subject of legal measures. Household accounts recorded which servants or retainers were provided clothing, who received food, whose wages were paid. That ledger language, in the household, removed from attendance, transferred to custody, is functional. It sorts bodies and assigns responsibilities. When a steward writes a note that a person is no longer to have their livery, that is not merely a sartorial change. It is a redefinition of social standing. When a clerk marks an entry, taken into custody, or to be sent to another house, the handwriting is a vehicle for transfer. The state of personhood has shifted from ambiguous to administratively clear. Small private acts, a braid cut, a token taken, are the visible signs that make sense of the new ledger entry. They supply the material evidence that a clerk can translate into paper. There is, too, the nested authority of religion and ritual. Ecclesiastical rhetoric could sanctify or shame. A chaplain's presence might lend moral language to a household decision. The vocabulary of confession, virtue, and sin could be enlisted to frame private access as pastoral or disciplinary, even when such access was coercive. The language of repentance or moral failing, once recorded and circulated, did work. It furnished a moral architecture that supported legal action. A warrant couched as a religious concern carried different force than a secular memorandum. In the Tudor world, where law and piety were tightly braided, witnesses could claim that what happened in private was for her good, for the realm's purity, or for spiritual correction. Those claims were persuasive because they used a shared vocabulary. They also had the practical effect of making later legal steps, investigations, charges, bills, seem reasonable to a public steeped in religious rhetoric. Now return to the dramatized room. After the braid is cut and hidden, the ledger comes into focus as an agent of erasure. Clerks relish precision. A clerk's hand brings ink to parchment and ways of counting that flatten human complexity into columns. Names, items removed, sums allotted, status changed. Livery withdrawn. Ring accounted. Servant reassigned. These flat, quiet entries are the administrative equivalents of sealing a person's fate. They make custody legible. They also create a paper trail that can be later used to justify or narrate public action. If it is written, it existed. If it is counted, it was accounted for. At the same time, surveillance permeated the household. The watchers, the spies and servants whose livelihood depended on attendance and loyalty, filled a particular function. Their reports were small, partial, and often used selectively. A watcher's note is a fragment, then a fragment becomes a rumor, and rumor becomes a report. Political actors could amplify a watcher's observation to serve a charge. Public trials and proclamations needed facts that the crowd would accept. Private watchings could be transmuted, by narrative shaping, into public indictment. We should be clear where hypothesis begins. Evidence for systematic shaving or branding as routine in Tudor bedchambers, for example, is not robust. But we do know, from inventories and household accounts, that clothing, hair, and personal items were carefully regulated, and that removal of tokens of status appeared in administrative records. We also know from contemporary correspondences and ambassadorial dispatches that spies and watchers often circulated information about private comportment in ways that could damage reputations. Where direct documentary evidence is thin, I rely on these documented practices to plausibly reconstruct how a private scene might operate as preparatory work for later legal action. Beyond the bedchamber's small acts of erasure stood a larger network, the clerks and the ledger rooms where decisions were made ordinary. Consider a second vignette, again a reconstructed composite, morning light in an administrative chamber, a clerk arranging a stack of bills. A memorandum is added to a bundle intended for the Privy Seal. An officer crosses out a name and writes beside it a short phrase that converts attendance to custody. These rooms were the architecture of procedure. A transfer order, brief, bureaucratic, traveled through hands and seals. Those signatures and stamps mattered. They rendered a person's status official. The watchers who provided the initial observation rarely saw the ledger entries. They saw the outward signs, a haircut or taken, a ring tucked away, a woman escorted by sergeants. The clerk saw the same person as an entry, a line in a book. Both views are partial, but together they created a chain. The private act supplied the evidence, the clerk supplied the record, the official supplied the authority. When assembled, this chain allowed the state to present later inversions, trials, attainders, public shaming, as procedures carried out legitimately. What of those small, stubborn acts of resistance? They are the reasons historians have any purchase at all on these stories. Stitched initials hidden under linings, a braid secreted in the seams of a mattress, a child's name scratched into a hearthstone. These are the traces that argue against total administrative erasure. We can narrate a day in the life of such traces. A woman, knowing that certain tokens will be taken that morning, slips a length of braid between folded sheets. She spends the day pretending compliance. At night she slips the braid into a warmed oven box or into a seam, where it will remain until a friend or relative can retrieve it. A seamstress, aware of what erasure does, stitches initials in a hem where the steward's inspection will not find them. A child is moved from a cradle to a servant's bed when officers descend, but the child's name remains scratched into the hearthstone where the mother once wrote it in a rare, unobserved hour. These small acts are not triumphs, they are fragile bets on memory's endurance. They nonetheless assert personhood when the formal apparatus seeks to erase it. Material evidence like this does not speak in full sentences. It is fragmentary, ambiguous, and open to interpretation. But taken together with household ledgers, ambassadorial notes, and the occasional surviving memorandum, it provides the scaffolding for plausible reconstruction. Historians work with patterns, repeated occurrences across documents, the way ledgers annotate clothing and attendance, the language used in warrants and letters. When similar motifs appear in distinct sources, that pattern builds trust that a practice existed, even if the exact moment remains unrecorded. For a moment, let us set aside the specific dramatized room and ask a deeper question. Why would those in power prefer private ritual to public violence? The answer lies in efficacy and optics. A private act of erasure, stripping livery, removing tokens, altering a woman's appearance or publicly recategorizing her, does two things. First, it reduces the target's social capital. People who are no longer visibly of a particular station lose the protectiveness of status. Second, it manufactures a narrative of consent or moral failing that can be used later to justify public measures. The private action frames a person as diminished, and the public act, trial, execution, exile, then reads as the culmination of an apparently rational process. In effect, the quietness of the private act creates plausible deniability for the perpetrators and social acceptance among observers. The transition from the private to the public follows a troubling logic. A small administrative step, an entry in a ledger, a warrant sealed, becomes evidence. Evidence becomes accusation. Accusation becomes public ritual. Consider a hypothetical chain of events in a reconstructed composite. A steward removes a ring and records it. A watcher writes a report stating an observed indiscretion. A clerk annotates the ledger and prepares a memorandum for legal authorities. A letter of accusation is passed to those who draft charges. A trial is convened, publicized, and theatrically staged. The courtroom spectacle then benefits from the prior process. What the crowd sees is the public drama, but the crowd rarely sees the prior administrative orchestration that rendered the person vulnerable in the first place. This is where the political utility of private coercion becomes clear. For those who sought to displace, humiliate, or remove a person from power, orchestrating behind-the-scenes disenfranchisement is often more efficient and less risky than immediate public confrontation. It also permits narrative control. Charges can be scripted in a way that the court and the market of public opinion will accept. Once a ledger entry, a warrant, a marked garment exist, they lend an aura of inevitability to the final display. Still, we must resist the temptation to attribute every procedural act to a grand conspiracy. Bureaucracies are rarely monolithic. They are composed of hundreds of small decisions, some malicious, some banal. Clerks might copy what they are told to copy. Stewards might perform their duties with the conviction that they are keeping order. The arrogance of institutions is that their small, routinized acts blur to produce outcomes that no single person intended in full. It is this systemic quality, where paper, ritual, and practice aggregate into coercive power, that is crucial to understand. There is also in these stories a gendered dimension. The regulation of hair, clothing, privacy, and sexual access is not only administrative, it is a technology for enforcing gendered norms and dependencies. To remove a token of feminine identity, a braid, a ring, a child's presence, is to attack the social anchors that enable a woman's claims on status and security. Instruments of governance made use of gendered codes. Religious rhetoric cloaked managerial acts in moral language. Household economies depended on women's labor, while also enforcing control over their bodies through access and deprivation. These are not neutral practices but power mechanisms that intersected with political struggles. Another reconstructed vignette shows the watchers turned into narrators. A lowly attendant is later summoned to give testimony. His memorandum reads like a list, stripped of context and compassion. Saw woman in chamber with steward. Observed removal of token. The testimony itself is partial, shaped by fear, hope, or the need to please a patron. Courtrooms and councils prefer facts they can read as simple. A watcher's fragmentary note can be repurposed within a juridical script that omits nuance. The testimony's rhetorical shape, short, conclusive, easily repeated, fits into the machinery that will later present the public case. When we watch these processes from the present, two things become important. First, we must preserve the individuality of those who suffered. Do not reduce them to mere examples of institutional logic. Remember the lace of a braid, the scent of warmed linen, the way a child's name was etched into a stone with a blunt instrument. Those details insist on lived experience. Second, we must place the reconstructed imagination in methodological brackets. This piece repeats the phrase because it matters. Reconstructed composite. This particular tableau is our interpretive tool, not a newly discovered archive. So why do these reconstructions matter for viewers today? Because monuments and museums, palaces polished for tourism, portraits framed in gilded halls, regularly obscure the quotidian procedures of power. A painting of a queen in a formal gown tells us about representation. It says little about the small administrative processes that could erode agency. When a palace guide speaks of ceremonial splendor, rarely do they speak of the ledger room, where a clerk's hand removed a line of protection, or of the bedchamber where tokens were taken. Yet, those rooms are where the mechanics of dispossession were enacted. There is an ethical responsibility in how we narrate such histories. We should display the traces of resistance when we can, and when we reconstruct, we should be modest in our claims. A reconstructed scene can illuminate dynamics. It must not be worn as a badge of definitive proof. To be a responsible historian and storyteller is to keep the interpretive frame visible. Here is a possible, plausible pattern, not an absolute conclusion. Near the end of this narrative, return to the motifs: braid, ledger, scratch on stone. The braid, hidden in linen, preserved by a garment's seam, reappears at the moment of reckoning. A friend or servant later retrieves it and keeps it like an archive, a small private protest against the ledger's cold lines. The ledger, in turn, is shown again as a physical object: ink blotches, marginalia, corrections, human marks showing hesitation and error. And the hearthstone, the child's name, half erased, suggests memory's tenacity. Together, these objects argue that erasure was never total. They are the means by which later generations can ask different questions. Finally, we must return to the title's prompt and the moral it implies. If Spies did witness such a scene in a bedchamber associated with Anne Boleyn, this reconstruction is one way to understand what small bureaucratic acts could do. It shows how intimacy is not simply personal. It can be governed, administered, and weaponized. It shows how ritual and record-making, haircut, token taken, ledger entry made private coercion legible and thus useful for public performance. And it insists on an ethical stance, the historian's duty to remember those whom official archives tried to reduce to lines on a page. One more methodological note before we close. Where the evidence is clear, we speak plainly. Where it is partial or absent, we make cautious analogies and label our dramatizations. A reconstructed composite is not a contrivance for spectacle. It is a tool for empathy and for understanding mechanisms. It helps us see how structural violence operates in ways that are often invisible in the sources we inherit. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, if you want more reconstructions that look beneath the gilded surfaces, please subscribe. We will continue to explore the quiet mechanics of power and the traces of those who resisted. As we end, imagine the empty cradle again, an overturned chair, a small length of braid folded inside a cloth. Picture a ledger whose entries have been blurred by time. The ink has faded, but the corrections remain, like scars. Imagine a hearthstone with faint marks that insist someone once marked a child's name into the world. These are the images to carry forward, the small tokens, the administrative lines, the stubborn marks of memory. They remind us that behind public spectacles lie quiet rituals that create conditions for those spectacles to take place, and that remembering the private steps is part of honoring those whose lives were constrained by them.